Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here. I'm hoping this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, our virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums, moving into the winter of 2022 and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. Tonight, we are delighted to be able to welcome Nadifa Mohamed in conversation with Tommy Orange. We are celebrating the publication of her new novel, the Booker Prize finalist, The Fortune Men, published by Alfred Knopf, based on the life of Mahmood Mattan, a man who lived in post-war Wales and was accused of a crime he did not commit, was executed, but then exonerated decades later. Ms. Mohamed builds a complex picture of both the man and his circumstances, giving us a view of Britain through the eyes of a black African, the reversal of Eurocentric perspective, and one filled with great insights and humanity. Nadifa Mohamed was born in Hargeisa, Somaliland. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I don't think I did. Later, she moved to London. She is the author of Black Mamba Boy and The Orchard of Lost Souls. She has received both the Betty Trask Award and the Somerset Maugham Award. And in 2013, she was named as one of Granta's best of young British novelists. Her work appears regularly in The Guardian and the BBC. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, she continues to make her home in London. And joining her tonight is Tommy Orange, no stranger to City Lights. Tommy Orange is a novelist and writer from Oakland. His first book, There, was one of the finalists for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize and received the 2019 American Book Award. Mr. Orange is a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He attended Institute of American Indian Arts and earned a master's in fine arts there. He was born and raised in Oakland, California, but makes his home in Angels Camp, California. So before we begin, I'd like to remind you we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of The Fortune Men, also books by Tommy Orange. We will also be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the evening. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome, Nadifa Mohamed and Tommy Orange. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Nadifa, for being here with me.
Pleasure.
And for writing this beautiful book. Where are you coming at us from? I think New York?
Yep,
Yes.
Manhattan. My 8th day here.
And
it's a break from the UK, which I really needed a break from.
And this is 8th day, like you haven't been to New York, like in general in your life?
I have, but I arrived this time round 8 days ago, I think. It was the 21st. So this is I haven't been back for 5-6 years. I didn't come here during the Trump years because I don't think I would have been allowed in. I was impacted by the Muslim ban. So it's been nice to come back without all of that hanging over my head.
Mm-hmm. And you're here for NYU, you had said earlier.
Yes, I'm teaching there.
Are you able to do anything, not that I'm encouraging it in any way, but are you able to do any part of this book? Because I think the US book was released just at the end of last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to do anything in person? Is that part of what's happening or no?
At the moment, no. Everything has been online, but I'm hoping also, I think we had our, God knows how, I don't know what wave it is now, 4th, 5th wave of COVID just before you guys. And I think it hit you guys later. So even now in New York, it's very quiet, surprisingly quiet. So not many in-person events are happening to my knowledge. And as the spring arrives, hopefully there'll be more.
And I think we are going to have you read a little bit from your beautiful book. I don't know if there's any type of intro you want to give for us before you start
I can.
into what you're reading.
Yep. So let me think. I tend to read from Mahmood's sections rather than the other characters. But tonight I'm feeling as if I maybe want to read from Berlin's little passage where he thinks back.
Love Berlin.
I love Berlin.
Sort of an earned love too, because at the beginning, he's a little bit more like, you're not so sure
A blowhard.
as we enter. Yeah, but you end up, I ended up loving Berlin so much.
Yeah.
And the way
me
that
too.
their origin story of their friendship.
Yes. Yeah. So this is a small section. Chapter 2. After turning the sign on the door, Berlin perches on a stool and lights a cigarette, his silhouette appearing and disappearing with the flashing jukebox lights. The floor is mopped, the till emptied, and the coffee machine cleaned. Just enough time to savor a last cigarette before Lou begins hollering for him to come to bed. He tries to empty his mind, but thoughts gallop up and down, bills that need to be paid, a court summons for street gambling, a memory of his long dead mother's incense, suddenly as strong as the cigarette smoke. Another of his American daughter's downturned infant mouth. He rises and opens the drawer behind the bar, pulls out an old postcard of the Empire State Building in a blizzard, postmarked 10 Decembers ago. Taeyage had written a short message in block capitals on the reverse, wishing him a good new year and telling him that he thinks he saw Lucille in a playground in Boreham Hill, and that she looked well and was climbing the frame as well as any steel worker. The postcard has been in the drawer since it arrived, Berlin thinking that any day now he will reply, but somehow never managing to do it. Brooklyn is lost to the past, to the man he had been before the Johnson-Reed Act had cleansed America of men like him. He struggles to keep old worlds alive, friends, lovers, even children seem to deliquesce when he turns his back, appearing in fragments in his dreams and quiet moments to stake their claim on him. I'll read again later.
I love this moment so much, and I think it relates to a lot of questions I have as well. And let's just start with Berlin here. We get this after Berlin reads a note from Mahmood's mother, and this sort of gets him thinking about his past and different correspondences. And there's this amazing passage in there where he's talking about being a part of a sort of human zoo, which in my research in the past couple of years I've come across as being, in the UK and here and other parts of Europe, where people who aren't white, basically, historically, who are human curiosities, become a part of these sort of human zoo things. And you have this moment where Berlin meets up with this American Indian guy who's a Mohawk guy who he met, and then ended up seeing him again after he basically got robbed after kind of a wild night out that he hadn't expected. So it makes me wonder, and this is sort of a question that I'll probably keep bringing up, but the level of research, like I found myself while reading, because I read it knowing it's a real thing that happened, but also that it was this imagined thing, because you have this like novel frame to it. It's a novel, so the imagination is at work, and that there's a real thing and with Berlin and this past memory that I think must come from the imagination, but also is influenced by research. Can you talk about your process in researching and where things like this sort of spring from in your process? Because it was so fascinating, because these things are true, but you obviously imagine so much, because in your language is where, you know, the way that you write, the beautiful way that you write, I can see what you're imagining into the language of it, that it's both you and the research happening at once.
Oh, great question. So it's a real mixture. And so to start on the research, I've been fascinated with human zoos for a really long time, not for any particular goal, but then while researching the world of Tiger Bay. So Berlin is based on a real character called Berlin, who had a cafe in Tiger Bay, but he wasn't as close to my knowledge as I have presented in the novel to Mahmood Mattan. So I've juxtaposed different characters and different real figures into these different relationships. But I spoke to Berlin's son, who still lives in Tiger Bay, and he filled me in on his father's background, including his time in a human zoo in Germany. And that I was so excited by that, because this was an old fascination of mine coming together with the current project. So there was no way on earth I couldn't write about it. And then by chance, I was in Peru for a book festival, and I met Tayage, who is from a Mohawk family in Canada. And we got talking about the Native American, Indigenous American experience of those human zoos across the world. And including individuals who hadn't survived that, who had been lost in Europe through illness, through all sorts of terrible outcomes. So I knew that I was tapping into something global, something that crossed the intimate history of this particular world that I was writing about. And also what the reality of, what the experience of that is. So when Berlin's son was telling me about his father's childhood in this human zoo, it wasn't with any great sense of tragedy or shame or anger. It was just another part of this kind of chaotic, funny life that his father had lived. And he'd gone from that life and become a sailor by stealing an Arab man's papers. So all of this shape-shifting, this throwing yourself into completely mad situations was part of the world that Mahmood knew, that Berlin knew, that my father knew. And I wanted to get across that, you know, there is a loss that they sometimes have to think about, that chases them, that they try and keep at arm's length. My father was very, very close to his mother, but he wouldn't see her for years. And she couldn't read or write. And when he was first in the UK, he couldn't read or write. But I found this really, on the back of a stamp that he had saved, there was a fragment of a letter that she had written for her by a scribe in Eritrea in 1949. So she was still chasing him, despite the fact that she was illiterate and he was illiterate. She could still grab his ear. And I found that really interesting. And I'm sure all of these Somali mums were trying to grab the ears of their errant sons.
Sorry. Was this piece that you knew about or had read, this very visceral, evocative, like sort of my heart, my liver, this language, was that directly pulled from that kind of
good, very
research?
perceptive? Yeah, it was actually. It was not from that tiny fragment of a letter, but from the tapes that my grandmother used to send to my father in the 80s, after we had left and she was there still in Hargeisa. So yes, you should start every cassette with this kind of poem, invocation. And he is her knees, he is her firstborn, he's like the apple of her eye, he's the blood that runs through her veins. It's so intense. And then, you know, she'll get to us, she'll get to the grandchildren. And there's such artistry in her language for someone who's never been to school. You know, it's not about schooling, it's about something, I guess it's what all writing is about. It's about connection between, your feeling and your ability to express that in words. And she's excellent at it. And so I think, the letter that Mahmood's mother writes to him is the sort of thing I would imagine my grandmother writing to my father.
I think there's a line right around that time, poetry is war, because Mahmood is talking to Berlin about this and sort of like, what do you want? A truce. And I can't help but wonder lines like that, because my big wonder to you, because I listened to some interviews, there's so many moments where you feel so natural as a writer, as a novelist, as somebody who is breathing life into this story, that I can't imagine it any other way. But you weren't, you didn't dream of being a novelist as a young child. It came to you later. You're like a historian, went to Oxford. At what point did you feel like this sort of poetic form that is contextualized in the novel form started to feel like, oh, this is it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Not like fate or fortune, but like just like, oh, these lines of language that are occurring to me that are steeped in truth, like whether it be personal history with your family, your grandmother, your father, or this story. At what point did you feel like, oh, I'm going to write novels? Because that seems like a departure point that happened for you a little bit later in life.
It creeped up on me. And I think it was a kind of mechanism that needed to happen. And in hindsight, my brain works in the way that a novelist needs their brain to work. That mixture of obsession and also being quite scattered and having all of these different elements that you pull together. But the focus and obsession that you need to do that work is the way that my brain operates without me putting it towards fiction or writing or any creative activity. But I think it was the emotional need to get to know who I was, where I was, what was happening around me, my history in both a personal sense and in a more general sense. I think that's when I went to university and was studying history and politics and not seeing anything really related to me in that course or in those courses, I started to feel fatigued. I started to feel really tired and lost. And so the first ever interview I did with my father was while I was still at university. And I can't remember why. I think I was just playing around with a new gadget. I had a mini disc recorder thing and a new microphone. So I started talking to my dad about his life. But that was something that didn't stop. And I found out about Mahmood Mattan's case just after university finished, when I was in my first internship for a film company. And I saw his face in a newspaper and read about what had happened to him. And then got talking to my father, who had known him. They were both Somali sailors who'd arrived in 1947 in the UK. But even I started writing my father's story in this way that didn't really make sense. It was something I just had to do. And I told myself it was because I was recording his life history for my first niece who had been born around then. But it was like scratching an itch, and you just keep going at it until you get somewhere. But maybe it's only with this third novel that I really started to understand that it's something I can do repeatedly, and not just in these two bursts that could have been the whole entirety of my output. I think that something clicked with this novel that made me feel as if whatever mechanism, if we want to call it a mechanism, is there, is now fully in motion.
You do something throughout the novel that's doing a few things, and it's it's somewhat standard in novels. It's a sort of list making is something that novelists do to build the world, but you do it so beautifully and so specifically. And I wonder if you can talk about the way research, which clearly you've done a lot of, what is the marriage of like list making and research? Because you found this harmony of doing that in this incredible, enviable way that while I was reading, I'm like, wow, like this is another beautiful list that like so miraculously transitions into the point that you're making about the character or the scene, that like, it's just incredible. But I wonder if you could talk about that sort of marriage.
Yeah, I think I'm not a list maker in my own life, but my dad loved listing things. So he'd list places he'd been or countries, facts about particular countries. And I think there's a specific male thing, and it's maybe a generational thing, maybe it's also a geographical thing of listing that I associate with my father and his generation. But almost to prove something, they list it. And some of the lists that appear in the novel are lists that caught my imagination, particularly. There's one I can read from actually, because I love the rhythm of it so much. And it was while I was watching a documentary series called Time Shift, and they use archival material. It's a BBC documentary series. And this one was focused on the docks and ports of Britain. And I just heard this list and I thought, oh yes, look at all of that. Look at all of those jobs that Mahmood would have known about. And that would be his world. And people think about dockers or dock workers, but that's not right. There's so many, it's precise roles. And within that hierarchy, within that ecosystem, it was racialized. Some jobs would only be for English workers. Some of them would only be for Somalis or other migrant workers. So I found that very revealing, and I just loved the music, the musicality of it. Where is it? Where is this? Ask me a question while I look for
it. Okay, this is an easy one. You probably answered it already. Let's start at the front, which is the cover. Can you talk a little bit about the name of the novel, but also the photograph that I was gonna try to look it up, which maybe I wouldn't have been able to, but it's so fascinating. The faces of these men, which seem to be, at least a few of them are definitely the same man. But I wonder if you could tell us about the Fortune Man as a title to the novel, and also what this image on the front that we get, what is that?
So The Fortune Men is a title that came pretty late to me. This novel's had so many different titles, and my editor wasn't happy with any of the previous ones. So
Can we hear a couple?
So the one that stayed for a long time was The Stoker, because he was a stoker, and I like
Obviously
the finality of it. And there's also a lovely short story by Franz Kafka called The Stoker. Another one was, so there was two versions of this. There was The Ship of the World to Come, and then there was The World to Come. So that was probably the book that's the title of the book when it was bought by my publisher. And there was another novel called The World to Come by the same publisher, so that wasn't a good move. And so I wrote lists. It's one of the few times I wrote lists for myself, and I wrote lists of potential titles, and there were so many. But The Fortune Man, the minute I think I started off by thinking The Fortune Man, and then I thought, no, The Fortune Men. And it's a term that comes up in my first novel. It was a term that my father told me about, used to refer to men like him who had gone to join the British Merchant Navy. And it was both a point of, oh, now you will make so much money, you will have a fortune, you will earn a fortune, but also the sense that they were men who had put their lives in the hands of fortune, in fate, many of them would never return. They would die at sea. They would disappear into different worlds, marry foreign women and raise their kids there and be buried in these strange places. So I liked that. And I thought that was true, actually, that Mahmood was a man of fortune in many ways. He was a gambler. He was someone who risked everything again and again, but he was part of a group of men like that. And I thought it was only fair to show that in the title. And the picture is actually of West Indian migrants to Britain. They came in a big rush from 1948 onwards. So my dad and Mahmood beat them by a year, but they became the face of Black migration into Britain from the late 40s, 50s onwards. So this is of their arrival. They would normally get a ship and then they would get a train into London. And what I love about this is that you can feel the energy, you can feel the movement in their bodies, in their faces. It's very different from the cover in the UK, which is of a Somali guy in Tiger Bay, and he's still and looking at the camera. He's very aware of that camera, and it's a photojournalist who's taking pictures of Tiger Bay. And I get the feeling that this tall Somali man has been following him because he appears in quite a few of the photojournalist's images. Well, this is the opposite. This is a photojournalist who's lost in the crowd, and they're lost in the crowd. And I liked, these blobs. They were an idea that came from the designer, and I liked the kind of 1950s look that they have. And it's in a way the blobs highlight this individual in the middle, but my attention goes to a different man each time I look, and that it's almost like a spotlight that's falling on a different face each time. And that's pretty much, I think, what happened to Mahmood, is that he fell under the searchlight, a spotlight that he didn't belong under, but it was roaming around and then it fixed on him. But I have found the list that I was looking for.
I was going to give you one to read that I want you to read if not.
Okay.
That has to do with the stoker.
Okay. Where's that?
This is on page 20. And I'll just give you, it's a short one. You could go right into what you were going to read after.
Okay.
But it's just such a beautiful microcosm of kind of the macrocosm of what you do in the book, that is about this this sort of yellow to orange, white, blue, and then pure energy sort of movement that happens in the whole book that I feel was so, and it's it's a very Stoker moment.
It is a very Stoker moment. I know exactly what you mean. Okay, so I'll start from pulling his Homburg hat low over his eyebrows. He takes a yellow ticket stamped with a number 9 and waits his turn for the counter beside one of the heavy coiled radiators. The heat from the cast iron blasts through his thin trousers and teases his skin, somewhere between pleasure and pain. And he rocks his body back and forth, letting the heat rise and dissipate. On the last tramper he had taken, the owners had installed new boilers, and all the brass fittings had shone gold in the white light of the furnaces. He had stepped back to admire the conflagration before shoveling more coal in and turning the white light into an almost sentient, colorless gas that roved backwards and up the chimney like a genie escaping a lamp. He had birthed that fire and nurtured it, from yellow to orange to white to blue, and then that color that had no name, just pure energy. He'd wondered what it would be like to step forward the few inches that separated him from it, whether, like in Adabka, his skin would just fall off from his flesh like a sheet. He had been formed by those fires, turned from a puny pantry boy into a knotted, muscled stoker who could stand at Hell's Gate for hours at a stretch, his face roasted and grimy with coal dust.
Beautiful. There's a moment that I feel like it just occurred to me, sort of pairs with that. After the trial, he talks about the sort of hell of having to be around people and wishing he could sort of rip open his skin and step out of it that feels like it belongs with that
I hadn't made that
passage.
connection. You're right. You're right. And that's, I think it may be in Black Mamba Boy as well. There's a moment where Jama, the main character, is a boy, is a very young boy, gets so angry that he wants to step out of his skin. You know, this feeling that he's trapped, he's cornered even by his own flesh. And I'm not quite sure where that idea comes from for me, but is there an Islamic? There is that image of hell and your skin falling off just so it can be regrown and fall off again. That is part of Islamic teaching. But Mahmood is loving it. He's loving the idea. There's almost a masochistic thing going on. And I think it's connected to this idea of masculinity. There's somewhere else in the novel as well where his ma'alim, his teacher, when he's young in Quranic school, says that men, but I think it's even true, it's even told to women, have to be like charcoal, that you have to keep being burnt again and again until you form this external, ignitable part of you. And otherwise, when you're young, you're too soft, you can't survive, you can't do anything. And it's only by this process of being burnt and burnt again that you can really fully live and be an adult in the world. And there's also the idea of the coal, the fire in the ship, where Mahmood's first ship is slowly burning in one of the bunkers. There's this coal fire, and the Yemeni trimmer says to him, there's no way to put out the fire but to burn it. There's many kind of instances, I think, that connect, and it's not conscious. You know, I wasn't writing thinking, oh, this scene will meet or, you know, relate to the previous scene, but it's the world that they lived in, and it's the world that I'm just about on the fringes of through the influence of my father and the men around him. But let me read this list.
Oh, yes, do.
The tall grand windows of Corey's Rest are steamed up, with figures laughing and dancing behind leaded glass. He peeks his head through the door to check if some of his regulars are there, but the West Indian faces around the snooker table are unfamiliar. He had once belonged to this army of workers, pulled in from all over the world, dredged in to replace the thousands of mariners lost in the war. Dockers, tallymen, kickers, stevedores, winchmen, hatchmen, samplers, grain porters, timber porters, tacklemen, yardmasters, teamers, dock watchmen, needlemen, ferrymen, shunters, pilots, tugboatmen, foyboatmen, freshwatermen, blacksmiths, jetty clerks, warehousemen, measurers, weighers, dredgermen, lumpers, launchmen, lightermen, crane drivers, coal trimmers, and his own battalion, the stokers.
Beautiful. And I think this is another, you know, like, obviously you're a novelist. This is your third novel. I have been struggling to finish a second one.
The evil, just get through it.
There's something in your listing that is so rhythmic and musical, that, you know, that the difference between obsessing over history or wanting to write something historical, or and getting involved with the language of a novel. What you do with all the lists throughout, it has to do with a kind of spellbinding thing, and it has to do with the musicality. That was a perfect example of that, that you do throughout.
Thank you.
So you were talking about the unconscious a second ago, and it always sort of hits my radar when I'm talking to novelists, because getting involved in a novel and the unconscious, that's just something that you're deciding to get involved with. But you also have been writing in sort of this family mode, you know, your grandmother, your father, with previous books, and now this is like, you know, the community that you, like you said, on the fringes of, that, you know, and that you're from to some extent. And you know, this, you know, colonizer situation with immigration. And I think Trevor Noah, who first brought it to my attention, this idea that, like, people would colonize places, and then you end up with people from the places you colonize, and you're sort of like
On your doorstep.
surprised that
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of that in Britain.
I'm wondering regarding your unconscious and the writing that comes out when you get involved with these deep projects such as novels, how this one differed, because it was not, even though you've mentioned that your father knew this man, how it differed between writing from sort of this family perspective and this family depth, and like this like historical case that literally part of the novel you had an edited down version of like the way it went down in court. What was the difference in terms of including things that came through that felt personal? And in this sense, and you at the beginning of the book you dedicated to Mahmood and the victim.
It gave me freedom at the beginning, I think. I realize now in hindsight how constrained I was in my first novel about writing about my father, and it was a welcome constrainment because he was a collaborator and it was his story and he could set the parameters. And in this case, because it was so historic, it happened almost 70 years this year actually, and it was a public case, a historic case, so I didn't feel as if it was too intimate somehow. The fact that I could go to the archives near me and read through the police interviews, the court transcripts, all of the paperwork that went back and forth between Cardiff and London, made it feel as if I could immerse myself in a way that I hadn't with my father's story or my second novel, because if stories are set in those colonized areas, places, then often there's a real lack of archives. You know, the British often burnt everything as they were leaving because they didn't want to leave anything incriminating. And the few things that remained are probably in Britain. They were brought back to Britain and are under lots of difficult conditions, so you can't actually access them. But this was a rare case where the British had already opened up a file before time. You know, there's normally a 70-year wait. But another researcher, Chris Phillips, had forced open through lots of freedom of information requests this whole file, and it was a real luxury to be able to read it in such detail, to read it in this contemporary, you know, as if I didn't know what the end was. You know, I was reading from the beginning where they first interview him in his boarding house the night of the murder, and he tells them to their faces that they're liars. And you know, he asks them, do they have a warrant? No, they don't, but they're still searching his room. They say that a colored man is believed responsible for the murder, and he's just like, oh yeah, sure thing, you know, he's really sarcastic about it. And then you see his first real interview with the police in the police station, and it's so polite and so strange, and they offer him sandwiches and tea, knowing at the same time that they don't have a legal right to keep him for so long, but he doesn't know that. So you see how softly it happens and how convincing the police are, because they're the ones who have left this archive, and it damns him. So I'm reading it part historian, part novelist, and thinking, okay, so his story doesn't make sense. The story that he gives doesn't make any sense. And then you start to become, the police sound so convincing, you start to be swayed over to their way of thinking. But at the same time, you know that his conviction was quashed 48 years later. So that confusion, because everything I'd read in the media up until that point had painted it as a very clear case, and Mahmood had been this naive simpleton who had been cruelly foisted, you know, into jail and then executed for a murder he didn't commit. But the man you see and the situation you see is more complex than that. And I started to feel annoyance with him because he was lying. He was, you know, avoiding simple facts that would have cleared his name, or at least made his case better. So I'm part shaking him and part fighting for him, and, you know, wishing I could be there for this young man who's completely out of his depth, and he only realizes he's out of his depth days before his execution. And he writes this letter. Well, he's illiterate, so he gets the policeman who's been instrumental in framing him to come to the execution cell, and he dictates this letter to him that's so prescient and powerful. And he says, you know, in this semi-broken English, that I know my life is bought cheap, and that if I had another skin that was not black, I would not be here now. But I don't, you know, I don't want the real killer to be hanged. You know, it's not fair that 2 lives should be taken for one. But someone knows something about this case, and it may take a long time, but someone someday will talk, which did happen. 48 years later, the case was quashed. But that's a very heartbreaking moment when Mahmood has almost completely resigned himself to what's going to happen. But yeah, I was surprised at how many of these very intimate moments still remained in the archive. And there was another thing that really captured my attention, is what his interviews with the police doctor, the prison doctor, which had a different tone. You know, that wasn't part of the prosecution. It was these conversations. And he seems to get along with the prison doctor because he tells him a bit more about his life and about his family life. You know, the prison doctor is helping to ascertain whether he's fit to stand trial. And Mahmood is fit, you know, he's not insane. He doesn't have any learning disabilities. But yeah, that young man who's still a bit cocky, and, you know, he's thinking that for the time he's in prison, he will get compensation. He's thinking ahead, you know, he's that kind of person. But there are all of these different elements of him that come out in that archive.
You were just mentioning the part where he sort of is allowed, after he's convicted, with Detective Powell, who comes in, he's able to dictate sort of his last testimony, which I think, according to Perkins, a lot of the time, these guys let it off their chest and admit it, and he's sort of like, I'm surprised that you're not doing that. But there's this beautiful thing that you do, and I guess this is maybe from the actual archive, where, because he knows this neighborhood, or this where he lives so well, he's like, well, based on this guy's testimony, the way that he described this scene, nobody would have come out and killed somebody if these many people were out looking.
Yeah,
it was just this beautiful irony that he would know it so well. Like it's the very essence of him not being capable of doing the murder that makes him know this thing so well, that makes it so obvious that he was innocent. That is obviously too late and sort of beyond the point, but that he knows it. He knows, like, he knows for himself in that moment. He knows for himself, like, this is how I know this is.
And it also shows he's obsessive. He's been thinking obsessively about what was said in court. And that was, you know, this is something that he really did describe in that letter. And he did hear it in court from that chief prosecution witness, Harold Cover. And he's obsessing. He's thinking it didn't make sense. Well, he knows that he's innocent. His wife knows that he's innocent, but no one else seems to believe it. But he's picking through. He is clever. He's an intelligent man. And that's also what the prison doctor said. He's a very clever man. And he's going over it as if he's his own barrister and looking for these. And there's so many contradictions in what's said in court. You know, the 2 men that live with him in the boarding house, there's an hour and something difference in what time they say he comes home, or not comes home, but leaves the front room. So how can you mistake 7:30 for 10? You know, it just is impossible. But that was left alone. You know, that was left alone in the trial. No one followed it up. The May Gray, who lies as well blatantly, and she is, you know, the barrister, defense barrister, does pull her up on her lies. But, you know, she's saying that he came in fresh from the murder wearing white trousers. Who would, you know, it's just absolutely ridiculous. But I can't imagine what it must feel like to hear stuff like that and knowing your life is on the line. And it's so ridiculous, and yet you can't do anything about it. You know, the greatest minds, the greatest legal judges think that it all makes sense. And you're the one who's mad. You're the one who's evil.
Mm-hmm. We spoke a little bit before getting on live about kind of the divide between UK English publishing and American English publishing. And I mean, that's its own conversation, but there is something lost in the unity, the unity in subject matter around race and these immigration problems and colonization specifically as a focal point in the way that binds our stories together. What do you hope that Americans can come to understand through this novel, to come to better understand, to contextualize colonization, Somalia, the UK, the last hanged man in Cardiff in Wales? What are you hoping that the novelization of this event can do toward multiple things, which I think it can, which I think you do beautifully, the way you've layered things?
I think maybe I'd hope that it would break down some of those preconceived boundaries. So when Black history in Britain is discussed, it's nearly 100% about the Windrush generation, Caribbean migration to Britain. And it's done in this very sort of linear way of, oh, it was quite difficult for them at the beginning, but now everyone is integrated and how lovely it is. Or if it's Muslim immigration, then it's Pakistanis and how tough it was and how it's now complicated in a different sense. So that position of being Black and Muslim is completely lost within that. But also, it's very unpolitical discussions of race in Britain. You know, it's almost as if we don't talk about the empire we don't learn about the empire in schools or even universities at all, really. You'd probably have to do MA level studies before you'd focus in on the empire. And you have this general sense across the country that the empire was generally a good thing and helped people. I had a conversation with my neighbor over the garden fence, and he started the conversation by talking about Cecil Rhodes and how he wasn't that bad, really, which set me off. And then it ended up with me really explaining, in my view, what the empire meant and the violence and brutality it involved, and him saying, but it spread democracy or something. And, you know, he was someone who's older and he had been raised in that culture of not being able to think critically about power. While the men subject to it, whether they were Somali, Malay, Yemeni, Vietnamese, First Nations, Canadian, whatever they were, they had a completely different experience of what that power meant. And the inheritors of both groups still have very, very different views on what all of that history has meant. And I think that's the case in the US as well. You know, it seems to be the case. But what I think is missing is an honesty. Mahmood he doesn't have to be a pure innocent victim for him to throw a light on the worst of the British state. And I think, you know, sometimes when I post things about human zoos, just say, online, it's young Somalis that get very angry with me because they think I'm celebrating it or I'm sharing the humiliation of these Somalis. Well, for me, it's not, I don't think back because I want to just judge or I want to feel good or I want to feel empowered. I prefer just to see things as they are, however ugly that is. And there's this conversation at the moment about how to teach the Holocaust, how to teach slavery. And I'm thinking back to the way I learned about things, and it was with the most brutal information coming first. You know, I wasn't ever sheltered from the worst of human behavior, which has now made me I think I've reached saturation level. There's only so much I can read and view anymore. But I do think it's important to not hide. You don't need anything to be sanitized for you to be allowed to learn about it. You know, how can you sanitize these horrific things? I don't think you can. I think you should measure how much you intake and when and how, but it's your duty to also open your eyes and bear witness, I think.
Beautifully said. I think so often we get tired of some of the academic language or some of the rote language that we hear, like colonization, and in place of it, sometimes it's dehumanization is the better word for colonization, through the most horrific example like human zoo, and even unity from experience, which across the pond, as they say, and here, the way that colonization has dehumanized populations, and that we continue to feel those effects through justice system, through political systems, through economic systems. Dehumanization is what we're still feeling, which is why, books like this and addressing these injustices is so relevant still,
Yeah,
because we still feel that and in your book you point out several times that Mahmood is a savage, and they speak of these people as savages. And obviously for a native person such as myself, like savage is a word that like rings loud, but it's not just here. It's a dehumanizing word that's used all over the place.
It is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just chipping in because I think you made me think about something, which is how prisons are probably the most direct connections to that history. Because it's so strange, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in the US, whether you're in Britain, the people in those jails, in most unreasonable numbers, the most disproportionate numbers, are those colonized people. The prisons are still there to finish that job, that slavery, colonization, that dehumanization of all types started off doing. They're there to take the labor, to take the freedom, to control the bodies of these people. And that's probably what made me focus in on this case, because, they even keep Mahmood's body. That's part of the punishment, is that they hang him and then they keep his body in an unmarked grave in the vegetable plot of the prison. And, this idea of savagery that Britain had, and the idea that they were spreading decent laws and humane laws around the world, which was just not the case in Somalia at that time. If you killed someone, you wouldn't be executed by this kind of state. You would have to come to some sort of negotiation with the people of the family members of the person you've harmed. And if you can't, if you refuse to compensate, if you refuse to admit guilt, then your life is at threat, but from them directly. So it creates this tension, and often it's not the murder victim and the perpetrator only, it's the community around them that gets involved. And that's not a perfect solution at all. And it perpetuated feuds and various other types of violence. But I think they would find it shocking for a state to come and take someone's life and then keep their body as if that person had no family and had no control of their own fate, in a way. And when I read about children's bodies being found in residential schools in Canada, it makes me think of that. It wasn't enough to take their life, to take their freedom, but you hid their bodies, or you melted down their bodies and put them in museums, or gave them to universities who traded in these bodies. And that's true across the colonizing world. This is part of the loot. And there was a really shocking case from the bombing of the Africa group in Philadelphia. And it turns out that 2 of the children's remains had been used in training, pathology training in a university there, and with no consent given from their living relatives and no knowledge even. And then their remains were discarded. So this is something in particular that I find, this is where the worst of the last 200, 500 years is still very much with us.
Well, and to some extent, the Fortune Men is, bringing to life the remains of something that's unknown and unresolved, like these bones that end up in the wrong places, because, we still don't know. And that's, uh, I think we're a little bit too late for me to ask why you think, who you think did it, and why you think it was the last hanging. We're way too far into this interview, I think, for me to ask you those things. But I do want to know them. I want you to know that I want to know them.
Okay, I'll let you know.
I'm not sure, Peter, where we're at. There's a couple questions. I don't know if I missed questions that weren't. Peter, if you want to fill in.
Please go ahead. I mean, unless you want me to kind of pluck them out, I'm happy to pluck them out if I can find it. But
I mean, I saw a couple that seemed to be related, like more closely to when we were in the context
right.
Of the conversation, but I don't see any new ones other than two. There, I think there was a couple.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to go for it, what you were going to ask, I'd love to hear you ask that. We do have time.
So
Nadifa, do you mind?
Well, I'm becoming more careful because I think when I was writing, I was in that mode where I could do what I liked with the story, and now, you know, now that it's published, I remember that we're talking about real people. So I don't want to name any names, but I think I know who did it, and it was another Somali sailor, tall one, 6 foot, who matched the description of one of the people seen, and he said to another Somali guy, "I was the last person in the shop, and the police were looking for me. Police are looking for me." And he quickly ran away to Manchester and then got on a ship to Brazil, where he got ill and had to be hospitalized. And I traced his life, and I know that he died on board a ship off the coast of Jamaica in 1970, I think, or in the 70s. But I think he's the most likely candidate. And I showed a picture of him. I had a picture sent of him to the murder victim's niece, who had seen the man. And she said, yeah, I think that was him.
Wow.
We're talking of, you know, a memory that's 70 years old. But she thinks that was a similar face to the face she saw on that doorstep.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was looking at some of the questions. I think you've already answered those questions just throughout the course of your natural
Conversation.
Yeah. So I don't know if, you know.
There's the question of why Mahmood, why this story? And I think I was shocked by everything about it. I think it came in my early 20s when a lot of the background information that I've picked up since I didn't have. So the fact that he was in Britain at this time, the fact that hanging, you know, execution was still a possibility at this time, that he was innocent, that he was so young, that there was this big love story between him and this Welsh young woman. All of it really caught my attention, and it was a slow burner. And for a long time, I kept being, you know, interested, and I would, you know, keep up to date with any information that came up about the case. But I'd lost the idea that I would write it. And it was only in 2015 that I thought, this book needs to be written.
Well, if I may ask a question, what next? What are you working on now?
So I've got my notebook with me here, and I'm going back to the other book that I tried to write 2014-15 that wasn't going anywhere, and The Fortune Men Replaced. And it's about a family, a British Somali family in London, mother and 2 daughters. And I've been really struggling with what the plot is, but I know who the characters are, and I know the tensions between the characters. But I think it will be a look at the idea of inherited trauma as lived out in just everyday life for these women. Religion, vengeance, you know, rejection, all of these things, all of these basic things.
Well, we look forward to that. Actually, Tommy, when is your book due?
I don't know. I'm waiting to hear back from my editor. And I think once I get that feedback, I'll have a better idea. But, you know, I turned in the last draft, and
Congratulations.
The second book is really hard.
It is. It was evil for me, really evil. I just had to throw it out, just take it like a piece of meat.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
I can see one question from Amal, and I think she's Somali because she's asking what Mahmood's Gabil, his clan and his people, the people close to him, thought about the novel. So I've spoken to his family. I met his granddaughter in Wales, and she didn't know him. She grew up sort of away from the main family. But I go to Hargeisa, Somaliland, which is both mine and Mahmood's hometown. And the first night I was there in 2019, I think, I met a guy, he got talking to me, and his name was Mahmood Mattan, and he was a relative of the Mahmood Mattan I was writing about, which felt very eerie.
Wow.
And I've been given the contact details for his brother's children's grandchildren or something, and they live in Tanzania, and another bunch live in the Gulf. So they're scattered around like many Somali families are. But I'm going to make contact with the Tanzanian side very soon.
Wow. Well, this has been such a rich discussion, and what an extraordinary book. Congratulations, Nadifa.
Thank
And
you.
Tommy, thank you so much for doing the honors tonight. I'm really, really grateful to you too. Really great interlocutor. And well, we look forward to your next books, both of you. Thank you again.
Thank you to everyone who's turned up tonight. Thank you so much to Tommy for reading the book so closely and, you know, making me remember some of these details and the connections between those bits that I'd completely not even thought about, actually. So yeah, that was really wonderful. And this is the last event for a good while. And this was a fantastic one. Thank you. Thank you to City
Thank you,
Lights.
Nadifa. So good to meet you here.
And you. Enjoy the Lunar New Year now.
Thank you.